Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Inside Florida Politics Podcast, powered by the USA Today Florida Network.
Okay, so the No Kings protest drew sizable crowds, even here in Red, Florida, and got President Donald Trump's attention, judging by, shall we say, a fecal-heavy video that he shared on social media. The redistricting push in Florida seems like yet another strike against minority voters. One more Catholic bishop in the state speaks out on the topic of immigration. And after painting over street crosswalks, Transportation Chief Sean Duffy is taking aim on plans to launch a rocket to the moon. Hey, I'm Antonio Fins, your host, and these are the topics I will be discussing on this episode with my USA Today Florida Network colleagues, Anna Goni-Lessan, John Kennedy, and making a special cameo appearance, our producer, Rob Landers, who has something to say this week. So, Anna, let's start with you. You covered last weekend's No Kings protests up in the state capitol area. Judging by the MAGA universe reactions, they seemed a bit stunned by the number of people that showed up and the peaceful nature of the demonstrations. The turnout in Florida was particularly notable because it has been such a pro-Trump region, and also because the president was here in town at Palm Beach this past weekend for his 11th visit to Mar-a-Lago this term. Tell us, what did you see and what message, if any, was sent?
It was a lot like the one over the summer. There's been some time in between. The Trump administration has done a lot more when it comes to immigration enforcement. We're in a shutdown right now, so things have progressed, and I think it was about the same amount, maybe a little bit more, of people who were here in front of the Florida Capitol. So you gather in front of the historic Capitol, right? And you that's where people protest, and then also kind of bleeds over into across the street, to like all the way in front of the sidewalk, in front of the county courthouse, which is kind of across the street from the Capitol. So all of that was full with people. It was obvious. It was peaceful, man. Like I think the median age, like I'm not gonna lie, it was like 65. Mm-hmm. Like it was a lot of older people. Tallahassee has been historically blue. We are a pretty Democrat leaning county. So, it was peaceful, chanting, signs. The signs were inventive, informative, lots of inflatables, a unicorn, a T-Rex, chicken. So, it was hot too. So I really kind of felt for those people in the inflatables.
Yeah. Let me ask you, what was there an issue that drove people? I know that we've been talking about, and we'll talk about immigration, but also now you mentioned the government shutdown, the whole issue of particularly in Democratic circles and people that never Trumpers and people that don't support the president. There's also the question of democracy and so forth, and democratic systems and processes and protocols. What were you hearing from people in general about what it was that they were protesting?
Oh, lots of anti-ICE signs. That was maybe like 1/3 to the signs that I saw. A lot of things, the no kings, that kind of thing. A lot of signs referencing fascism. So we saw a lot of that too. I saw some signs that were just, curse words. That's okay. Freedom of speech. Can't say that here, but I will say that it was a lot of anti-ICE.
All right.
Yeah, well, especially here in Florida. So.
All right. Well, speaking of ICE, okay, so the obviously the immigration issue has roiled the country and Florida as well, and the DeSantis administration has actually been eager, bullish, and joyful in assisting the quote-unquote largest mass deportation program in U.S. history. But a Catholic bishop has spoken out. You wrote about it. So what's up? What did the bishop say? And tell us a little bit about that.
So he's not the first bishop to speak out in support of immigrants in Florida. We had the Archbishop of Miami. We had Venice Beach, or the Venice Bishop. We've had other people of the Roman Catholic Church speak out. But this one is a little notable for two reasons. One, he is the bishop of the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. That is where Attorney General James Uthmire goes to church. He goes to the Co-Cathedral of St. Thomas More. Governor Ron DeSantis, also Catholic, goes to church in this diocese, supposedly. So that's their bishop speaking to them. That letter is Bishop Bill Walk speaking to them. That and two, this Panhandle area, Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, is, has been targeted by the state's immigration enforcement. So, as we saw earlier in the year, right, we saw a lot of traffic stops by FHP in the rural areas in Gadsden County, and in these areas that are that have agriculture workers who are Latino, who are Hispanic. We saw, we saw a lot of arrests. We saw a lot of detainers, excuse me, of people who were who the state says were undocumented, right? So this is an interesting diocese. This is an interesting area, right? Bishop Walk, he quoted the catechism, he quoted the Bible. In the Attorney General's response, they also quoted the catechism. They also quoted Pope John Paul II. I'm not here to go back and forth, but it's an interesting. It elicited an interesting response from the Attorney General's office. The governor's office did not respond. And I will say that even after everything, even though people have been detained going to and from church, the bishop said that he would not suspend the necessity for going to mass every week like they have in California. One bishop out there did that, and the bishop said, not at this time. They won't do that. So, we'll see if anyone else follows.
Yeah, well, it's getting interesting because Pope Leo the 14th himself has spoken out on immigration a couple of times, and most recently. And it's interesting, when he was named the Pope, when he was elected Pope, the choice of the name Leo, I think, kind of resonated. And I'm not the world's greatest theologian, but I am Catholic, and I do pay attention. It's interesting that the last Pope Leo was Pope Leo the 13th, who was the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, which was the era of mass immigration into the United States, and an era of worker rights. And Pope Leo was identified with that movement, that social justice movement, particularly for workers and so forth. And, so the history of the Catholic Church in America has largely been, really in many ways, identified with many immigrant communities, Italians, Italians, especially Irish and Poles, people from Poland. And it's kind of interesting, though, that a century later, we know that in the 2024 elections, about 2/3 of Catholics, supposedly, that's the number's been thrown out, voted for President Trump. So there seems to be kind of like this division within the church of, these bishops speaking out on an issue that is so central to the Trump administration and to the Make America Great Again movement, speaking out against it when if you cut across, every 2/3 of the parishioners, we follow voting patterns are probably people that voted for Mr. Trump. So they got to be, there's some care being taken here in how they address this. And, at the end of the day, you even have, these groups of very conservative, Catholic groups like, Catholic for Catholics, which meets at Mar-a-Lago every March. They have been pretty outspoken and critical recently of Pope Leo. So this is a fault line within the church.
Well, there are a lot of people in Florida's government who are Catholic, people who have been at the forefront of the immigration enforcement. So, yes, we have Governor Ron DeSantis, we have our Attorney General, but also, we have House Speaker Danny Perez. He is Catholic. He was there when President Trump came and visited Alligator Alcatraz. Senator Gruters, I believe he's Catholic. You might want to fact check, but I'm pretty sure he's Catholic. He was the one who sponsored the bills and during special session, right? Our state immigration enforcement bills. So, yeah, people have used religion for, for pushing their their ideology for a very long time. Gosh, we could go back to literally forever, since the beginning of humanity. So this isn't any different.
All right.
But yeah.
All right, John. So, Anna talked about the No Kings rallies. If you go back a good 8 years to 2017, Trump's first term, that first year in office, there was a lot of mobilization. At the time, the pig hats were kind of the iconic image of that era. And it did lead to a lot of political mobilization. Eventually, in the 2018 midterm year, there was a huge win for the Democrats. So we're seeing this again now. However, next year, the panorama might be very different, judging by what you've been reporting. This issue of, this effort to redistrict the state ahead of the next census, to basically give Republicans an opportunity to win more seats here in Florida. That's happening also in other states. So despite all the mobilization, it looks like the 2026 election, if all this redistricting happens, might be a foregone conclusion, or at very least a very uphill climb for Democrats. In Florida, it looks like it's also yet another setback for minority districts and minority voters, particularly those who are Democrats. Where do we stand? What have you found?
Yeah, well, Governor DeSantis still wants to do a mid-decade redistricting, and he may soon get some more momentum for this, courtesy of the United States Supreme Court. States with Republicans in command of either the governor's office or the legislature are responding to President Trump's demand for mid-decade redistricting. That's very rare. But the goal for Trump is to increase the number of winnable seats for Republicans next year. Trump, as we know, has poor poll numbers in terms of popularity and support from a majority of Americans. And he clearly senses that he'll follow the historic pattern of losing seats in the midterm. And the Republican majority, especially in the House, it's wafer thin. So there's a good chance Republicans will lose the majority for his last 2 years, unless they figure out a way to, tilt the table. So we've already seen Texas and Missouri adopt new congressional maps that help Republicans at the expense of minority-leaning districts. And DeSantis has also weighed in now that, he wants to do the same thing. He may get some help from Supreme Court justices. They recently heard arguments in a Louisiana case that could strike down a majority Black district as being racially gerrymandered. Now, this sounds familiar because the idea that giving Black voters or Hispanics enough votes in a district to elect a candidate of their choosing, that's been a central part of the Voting Rights Act since it was enacted in 1965. Giving minorities this opportunity was seen as a remedy for past discrimination. That, until the Voting Rights Act, there were very few minorities in Congress. That's changed. And now the times are changing again. And maybe from a minority's point of view, it's not for the better. The 6 conservative members of the Supreme Court, half of them appointed by Trump, they hinted during arguments this month that they see such districts as racially gerrymandered and potentially a violation of the United States Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. Basically, they hurt white voters, is the counter argument. Now, DeSantis used similar thinking 3 years ago in the last round of redistricting in this state, when he managed to create what he called a race-neutral map that eliminated a North Florida congressional district that a Black Democrat had for a couple of terms, and this left the state for the first time in 30 years with no Black representation north of Orlando. Now, DeSantis is clamoring again to redraw the congressional map, probably when the legislature convenes in January, and he would likely try to dramatically change 2 Black-leaning districts in South Florida and make nearby districts more competitive for Republican candidates in next year's critical midterms. Florida's 28-member congressional delegation already has 20 Republican members, but DeSantis wants more to satisfy Trump. Now, for Black voters in Florida, this is politically life-changing, but it's really more of what they've been dealing with for the past 5 years. since 2020, DeSantis and the legislature have enacted restrictions on, drop boxes, vote by mail ballot requests, and third-party voter registration groups. Remember, he created the Office of Election Crimes and Security in 2022, which some opponents saw as a real tactic that could intimidate many minority voters. And then, of course, a voter-approved effort back in 2018 to restore voting rights for those with past convictions who completed the terms of their sentences. That's really had a limited effect on, it's about 1.5 million Floridians that it was designed to help. But very few of them have managed to get their rights restored because of complications with this law.
Yeah, well, that's kind of an interesting question here. I just run by you. So, we already had, in the last podcast, we did talk about the Al Lawton district that was in northern Florida that was broken up last time after a census and after redistricting. And the districts that they're looking at here in Florida are here in South Florida, right? I mean, where are the minority dominant districts are looking at?
Well, there's two districts. One would span Palm Beach and Broward, and and then the other is in Miami-Dade. These are two districts represented by Congressman Frederica Wilson and also Congressman Trephilus McCormick.
Yeah. All right. So here's my question, because we also have 3 districts in South Florida that are minority heavy, but they're Cuban Americans that tend to be Republicans. Those are the ones now represented by Carlos Jimenez, Mario Diaz-Balart, and then Maria Elvira Salazar. Those are not in play, right? They're not looking to break this up.
Well, that's going to be the tricky part of this for DeSantis. He's going to have to figure out a way to preserve those Hispanic majority districts, which also could run afoul of this Supreme Court ruling, yet somehow just target the black districts. I think that's going to be part of the narrow thread that he's going to have to weave through this effort to do redistricting. He somehow has to preserve mostly those Hispanic-leaning districts and try to target the Democratic-leaning districts that are a black, but not even black majority.
Right, but that could open him up to a question. Yes. Wait a minute, how come you're not going out? If we're going to be even-handed here, let's break up all the minority districts, and to say, well, we're only going to break up the ones held by Black Democrats, but not touch the ones held by Cuban American Republicans, could strike people as being a little bit less than even-handed.
Oh yeah, that's very true, and that's going to be the political challenge that he faces. But what we've already seen with these law changes in recent years, in the last 5 years, you've seen a decline in black turnout. You're seeing 65% of black voters voted in 2020. That went down to 59% in the last election. So that's a significant drop. Mm-hmm. White voting turnout has remained mostly steady. And, why target black voters? About 3 out of 4 black voters are registered as Democrats in Florida. Mm-hmm. So if DeSantis is trying to help Trump by getting Republican votes, the best way is to try to start, recasting these Democratic leaning districts in South Florida. So black voters have a huge target on their backs, and an expected congressional redistricting effort in Florida is likely to further erode their political influence that they currently have, all because they vote Democrat at a time when Trump needs more Republicans.
Right. All right. Well, I'm going to welcome our producer, Rob Landers, who generally keeps a low profile in his producer role. But Rob is with our Florida Today team that covers the Space Coast. Rob, you usually don't hear much about the Florida Transportation Secretaries, but our current one, Sean Duffy, has been quite active. It was Duffy who kind of led the charge on repainting street crosswalks, many of which honored the LGBTQ communities. And now he's getting involved in the Artemis Moon Mission project. What's going on?
Okay, so in the absence of a NASA administrator, U.S. Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy is now playing a dual role. And he has proposed reopening a contract that SpaceX has had for $4.4 billion for Starship, the ship that Elon Musk keeps launching, and not the last one, but several of the test flights this year have ended in catastrophic disintegrations. But
that would not be a good thing.
No, especially not with astronauts on top of the ship. But the plan is to send Starship up to orbit, and then the Orion space capsule, which will have the Artemis 3 astronauts on it. This is supposed to be scheduled in 2027. Would rendezvous with Starship. Starship would take them down to the lunar surface. Well, Duffy has suggested reopening the contract because Starship is so far behind that we're actually losing the space race to China and Russia when we're desperately trying to get to the moon first, right? So earlier this year, Trump put the mandate out that we were going to have to get a nuclear reactor and figure out nuclear power on the moon sooner rather than later, because we were going to have to figure out a way to power our bases and provide power for astronauts living on the moon before China and Russia got there. China and Russia have been working on this for a long time. So Duffy is now in charge of picking the company that will build this nuclear reactor. He's taking a very, very large role in space. Like it's almost as Secretary of Transportation / NASA administrator, you're almost hearing more about him than you would a regular NASA administrator doing regular stuff. So Duffy is now pushing other companies to submit a bid. Now, that's great for the Space Coast. If SpaceX keeps the contract, Starship still moves to the Space Coast, employing thousands of people on the Space Coast. If SpaceX loses the Starship contract, other companies like Blue Origin, which already has rocket parks set up right outside of Kennedy Space Center, which manufactures its new Glenn rocket, as well as its Mark 1 cargo lander, and its soon-to-be produced Mark 2 crew lander, is already there, already set up, and already employs 4,000 people in Florida on the Space Coast. So one way or another, it's going to have a significant impact on the Space Coast and jobs here. So I think it's worth kind of keeping an eye on what Duffy is doing so far as making his moves for NASA.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, basically, Florida is a place that's always been linked to the space program. We have been traditionally the launch pad for all the NASA missions to space or into orbit with the space shuttle and the space stations and the telescopes and whatnot. And it's interesting, in Palm Beach County, we have also a major aerospace cluster of companies, including the ones that build some of the second stage engines for the Artemis rocket. And the whole point of this, by the way, is ultimately to go to Mars, which is really, the right now, the equivalent of the 1960s moonshot, the big space race. So it's become kind of interesting. It's also worth noting that the last NASA administrator, correct me if I'm wrong, was one Bill Nelson of Florida, who former senator who also went into space on a shuttle mission. Right. And he was the NASA director. Obviously, he was a Democrat when the Biden administration left. He left, and you need a new team in place. But Rob, I also want to ask you about the issue. I mentioned the issue of the crosswalks, and this is something that you've been following. You have a little bit of some insight into it. So they've been painting them over. I believe, if I'm not incorrect, right now Fort Lauderdale is the last holdout among cities that is holding on to a painted crosswalk, and in honor of there is a significant LGBTQ community in Broward County, so they're kind of holding the line. You've been following this issue. Share some thoughts with us.
Well, okay. So in Central Florida, Central Florida, Orlando particularly, is home to one of the, if not the worst, nightclub mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. The 2016, in June of 2016, a gunman went in on Latin dance night at Pulse and killed, I believe, 51 people, if I'm not mistaken. And part of the memorial has been the rainbow-colored crosswalk outside of the memorial, which has been painted over. Now, not only have I been following kind of that trend, but people who know me know that I'm a reality TV junkie, and so it's not lost on me that Sean Duffy, who kind of put this agenda out there, made his debut in front of the American public as a real-world Boston cast member, right? He also met his wife later that same year. That was in 1997. He met his wife later that same year on the Real World Road Rules Challenge Season 1. His wife was on the Real World San Francisco, where she met Pedro Zamora, who introduced Gen Xers to a real-life human being living with HIV/AIDS. The Pulse nightclub is exactly the place where Pedro would have been. He was a Cuban American who would have loved to have just been out dancing. Unfortunately, Zamora died from HIV/AIDS. And so you have this weird, it's ironic that you have Duffy, whose wife spent all of this time and lived with this man and grew to love him, as we all did because Pedro was amazing, painting over LGBTQ artwork in streets because it's now a distraction to drivers, even though it's been there for years.
Well, you know what? I think if anything speaks sometimes to politics in Florida, weird confluence of events probably speaks to that. We're going to wrap up the show here. I just want to again thank Rob for this time around playing this duo threat, being on the podcast and also producing it. And of course, as always, thank all our colleagues in the USA Today Florida Network, whose work informs this podcast. And without them and their work, it'd be really hard to put together this show. So thanks to all of them. And until next time, thank you. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.